Hello, and welcome back to Beyond the To-Do List, a podcast about productivity. I'm your host, Eric Fisher. My guest today has spent 2 decades as what she calls the creative whisperer to the C-suite, and one of the first things she'll tell a room full of executives is that some of their most important work looks a whole lot like staring out the window. So she's got 2 books out that are really one argument, that productivity was never the point, and that the way that you do your best thinking is by moving, thinking, and resting. Natalie Nixon, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So the new book is the 2nd edition of The Creativity Leap, and it's got a brand new chapter on working alongside AI. I'm very excited to talk about that, and that's where I want to end up, but I don't want to skip past the book right before it, Move, Think, Rest, because between the 2 of them, you've basically drawn what I look at as like a map. And the Creativity Leap says creativity is toggling between wonder and rigor, but Move, Think, Rest is how the movement, the thought, the rest make that toggle possible. So I want to start underneath all that and ask, you basically start Move, Think, Rest by describing what your most important work actually looks like from the outside. It's you looking at the birds in your yard, taking a slow walk past the neighbor's stoop, sitting and staring into space, which a lot of people would say is unproductive. But for you, for years, you assumed that was procrastination, like others would say. What convinced you that it wasn't?
Well, first of all, thank you again for having me. It's good to be in conversation with you. I have discovered as an entrepreneur and specifically as a solopreneur, I've had to do a lot of work to fortify my mind, to dim the negative Nancy, is what I call her, voice. We all have our own version of that when we are looking, dream big, hit micro goals, big goals. So I become a lot more self-aware over the past 9 years in building figure 8 thinking. And one of the things I started to notice is that when I would step away from my work, I work from home, and I would go down to the kitchen to unload the dishwasher or take a short walk around the block or take a daydream break, which I am a big advocate of. And we can talk about the neuroscience behind mind wandering and why that's so important later. But I observed about myself that when I returned to the work at hand, my thinking was sharper. A challenge that had stymied me all of a sudden clicked into place. And so while I was assuming that was procrastination and, would slap myself on the wrist, that's not a good thing to do, I just became really curious about this phenomenon of why it seemed that when I zoomed out, stepped away, and then returned to the work at hand, my thinking was crisper and clearer. So that's what prompted me to explore this. And initially, Eric, I was thinking that I was going to call this book and this work invisible work, because it seemed like a lot of what I now call the juicy bits of productivity, when we allow for the default mode network to become activated, which happens when we are at rest, when we step out of out of the world, it would drop into the body, or sometimes people like to say when we get out of our head and into our body, through movement, through taking a walk, through a rollicking joke with a good friend, reading a chapter in a book, in a novel, in fiction. These are all of the ways that different neurosynapses in different regions of the brain get activated, which actually helps that cognition and that sharper, clearer thinking to come into place. Well, that's not work that's trackable. That's not work that's traceable. That's not work that in the days when I worked in apparel fashion production, and literally, we would time, I wouldn't, but factory engineers would time how quickly a production line was working with a stopwatch. Work has really shifted. And so that's why I was calling it invisible work. But I also decided to defer to feminists who have spent years cataloging all the ways that women's unaccounted for and unpaid for work is invisible work. And I shifted over to finally calling it Move, Think, Rest.
Yeah. And that's a shift you seem to keep coming back to, from thinking about what we make or produce, which is funny because that's inherently in that root of the word productivity. It's how much do you produce, and shifting to thinking about what we might yield.
Yes.
You talk about the produce section of a grocery store, that the fruit that's made, what's yielding is bigger, health, security, and abundance. And so what changes for a person when they stop asking, how can I be more productive? And they start asking, how can I cultivate more meaning in what I do?
Well, what shifts is primarily we shift away from an either or focus and view of our work to a both and focus. And I leaned into asking the question, what might we cultivate? Because as I realized I was going to offer a soft critique of the ways we currently think about productivity, I had to also offer an alternative view. And so that prompted me to really research, well, where do our current views of productivity come from? And they're really rooted in the first industrial revolution of the late 19th century, where we valued what was visible. We measured only what we could see. It was outputs based. It was efficiencies based. And then I started to ask myself, well, what did the majority of the world look like before the industrial revolutions, plural? And most economies around the world were agricultural based economies. And I am not at all romanticizing farming. I actually, just before our call, was watering my diminutive little vegetable garden, which I have for 5 years in a row been hit and miss, been trying to tend with, and it's really hard. I'm not great at it, but I'm always happy. Like, we have this ginormous eggplant that came to be last week, but so I'm not romanticizing what's really involved with farming and agricultural economies. I mean, the earth is the original VUCA environment of being volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. What I do think is important to notice, though, is that should we still be only measuring productivity based on output efficiencies and only measuring what we can see, when two of the biggest forms of or mediums of work today are not even accounted for in GDP? And I'm thinking about email, I'm thinking about search engines, right? And these are modalities that help us to produce a lot. And so the MO of a cultivation, agricultural-based economy, when I say it's both and, it values the solo practitioner and the collective. Yes, we measure what we see. We also appreciate that there's a lot happening during dormant times, when we need to sleep on it, when we need to let things marinate. And it also, in the agricultural cultivation mode, we value speed and quick spurts of growth as well as slow. And so if fast forward, I'm really thinking that we have an opportunity to embrace a cultivation 2.0 way of working today. And even with the flexibility in working from home, working in the office, hybrid work models, that's the solo and the collective. The AI, LLMs that so many of us are using every day, that's the speed. But also, we have to design in time to slow down, to zoom out, to practice metacognition. Why do I think the way I think? Or why does our team think the way we think? Or why does our organization think the ways that we think about XYZ? And we have to appreciate that, yes, we absolutely should measure what we see, as well as understand that the work of teams is not only productive in the room, but it's when we step away, when we do deeper research and we come back to the collective or to our team. So that's what I am offering as a way to really have work that's not only productive on an output quantity basis, but is productive in helping us to really flourish collectively and individually.
Well, and you're careful to say that moving, thinking, and resting isn't procrastination, but you also say that, in the short term, it can look literally unproductive. And you've got that line about there's a difference between bird watching versus zoning out on reality TV. So how can people kind of sense the difference between what someone in management would say, just goofing off, versus the doing nothing that is actually productive?
Well, I think that we have to run experiments. We have to allow ourselves to engage in the doing nothingness. We have to shift the way we're thinking about liminal space and spaciousness. We have to understand the value of doing nothing so that we are more permissive in allowing people to do that. I also say that while goofing off is not the serious way to go about our work, there's so much research about the value of play. And I interviewed almost 60 people for this book. And one of the people I interviewed is Brendan Boyle, who is a professor at the Stanford D School. He teaches a course on play. I went out to Palo Alto, met him, sat in on his class, participated, observed, interviewed him afterwards. And he talks about how play is really engagement. And when you think about all the attributes of play, which are collaboration, empathy, curiosity, negotiation, actively listening, these are actually the skills that we want in our teammates. These are the skills that we want in our leaders. So why wouldn't we actually make sure that we have time for play, which really sparks engagement, not to mention the emotional reset that play helps us with, because it is shifting the nervous system in a way where it doesn't feel as stressed, where we are releasing the positive hormones like serotonin and endorphins, which really are calming for the body and actually help the mind to generate deeper focus and more synchronized thinking.
I didn't mean for that to come across as maybe a trick question, but I think maybe it was, because you flew, you caught it right away and basically took us there. So I'm glad that you did that.
Yeah.
Let's go to the engine underneath all of this. So in the creative leap, you're defining creativity in a way that I think catches some people off guard, not as art, but as the ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems and make meaning. And your whole case is that everybody's already doing this: the plumber, the accountant, the trader on the desk. And I guess make the case that a person listening who is dead, certainly they're not a creative type, but everybody else, they're alive, they're creative.
Yeah, well, the case I make is that to be human means that we're hardwired to be creative. And when we speak in terms of the creatives, or I'm not a creative type, then we are really only understanding a part of the story. It's interesting that in a lot of my keynotes, I will pause and ask the audience to raise their hand if they're able, and to share on a scale of 1 to 5, how creative do you self-describe yourself? A 1 being, not really as creative, and a 5 being, absolutely, I'm super creative. Typically, there's a bell curve where there's a sprinkling of people who say I'm a 1 or 2, and a sprinkling of people who say I'm absolutely a 5. And the most people are saying they're 2.53. It's interesting. I unpack how you just reflected out that the way I'm thinking about creativity is it's this toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. And I point out to people a lot of time when I asked how creative do you self-describe, what they heard me say is how artistic do you self-describe. And so artists are exceptional at wrestling with the ambiguity of the creative process. But it was really important for me to come up with a simple, accessible, and democratized way for us all to think about creativity, because in the early days of building figure eight thinking, I was getting invited into a lot of Fortune 500 companies, insurance companies, healthcare organizations, tech companies, media firms, to help them build cultures of innovation. And it was then that I began to discern that we were starting in the wrong place, that if we didn't start with building a capacity for creativity and building creativity as a strategic capability, innovation wouldn't stick. It would not become part of the culture. It would become more kind of copy paste, or even worse, cut paste. And that began my quest to figure out what's a way I can explain what creativity is without people assuming I'm talking about arts and crafts or playing a musical instrument or dance or visual arts. And through a series of miniature ethnographies and observations of the way dancers work, the way first responders work, the way chefs work, the way DJs work, I came up with this toggling between wonder and rigor. Excuse me. That's how I came up with the toggling between wonder and rigor. And I also just want to point out that it's not enough for me to tell you to off you go, toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems, and you'll be super creative. How do you keep that up? How do you sustain that toggling on a consistent basis? Because even artists have their bad days and months and years where they have to figure out, in my words, not theirs, where do I find the wonder? And where do I need to fine tune the rigor? And wonder is about awe and curiosity and audacity and pausing. And rigor is about focus and discipline and skill mastery and technique. Both wonder and rigor require us to slow down. They require deep thought. They require us to zoom out. So I just wanted to clarify that in order to sustain that, one on-ramp is move, think, rest. It's the movement, thought, and rest. That's the how. But another on-ramp is something in the first book, which is now has a second edition, which is what I call the 3 I's. Is through inquiry and improvisation and intuition is also how you can tap into ways to do that toggling between wonder and rigor.
And I think that's, we kind of have an example of this, don't we? With writers, they have this thing they call out. They say writer's block. And I think that's because that's a rigor side of things. And having that in play means then they feel like they've got that awe, that what if, that daydreaming side of thing incorporated into the rigor side of things. And you spent a lot of time on this. I think this is one of the issues that we have is that most people don't think of creativity as the both sides thing. We're in love with the wonder half. We don't really love the rigor half. We want to skip that part, but you jump right on into Twyla Tharp's line that before you can think outside the box, you have to start with a box. So what does that wonder crowd get wrong about discipline?
Well, I think it's because we assume that creativity is pulling something randomly out of your armpit, that it's something that is just a few folks are just gifted with, or it's something it's doing whatever you feel like. It's kind of the ways that people get improvisation wrong. People who've never taken an improv workshop or aren't familiar with what's involved with something like jazz improvisation or comedic improv don't realize that there are rules to improvisation. And that's the box that Twyla Tharp was referring to. And you actually need to understand the rules and spend time in really studying them, practicing them in order to have the freedom and the whimsy that is wonder. So, just for example, 2 things happened to me within a 12-hour period. I've been studying ballroom dance consistently for 6 years now. And I, 3 years ago, started doing open water swimming, not by myself. I do it with this organized swimming holiday, this company called Swim Trek, who actually first hipped me to Swim Trek. She's become a swim coach and she was helping me. And there was just one of the things we really tried to do was just give me 2 things to think about and focus on, because the rigor of thinking about how my fingers should not be really close together, should be some air pockets that shouldn't be spread out, and it should be kind of dangly making sure that my hand enters the water at the 2 o'clock area, and it should feel like I'm drawing the water back, like I have a volleyball. I had the image of a yoga ball, which is like too much, and then the second thing I was really focused on was my hip rotation, because everything actually leads from the hip. Just thinking about those 2 things was an incredibly rigorous process. And then last night I was at a West Coast swing group dance lesson, and it only follows where there were no leads there. So the instructor just had us, interestingly, focus on our first step. Our walking extends from the hip. So first of all, what a beautiful thing that 2 very different physical activities call upon the same area of the anatomy, so it helps my brain. And the role of metaphor, the role of reverse engineering and deconstructing the body in motion until it becomes something so fluid that I'll be able to do without thinking about it so hard in the way that I have to right now. Rigor actually can be fun. Rigor can get you in the zone. Rigor can reveal incredible mysteries of how things work together. I have this expression that that wonder is found in the midst of rigor, and rigor can't be sustained without wonder. They are copacetic, and that maybe is what people get wrong. They think they're two isolated things. But if you spend too much time with your head in the clouds, you're doing too much blue sky thinking, you'll never get traction. However, if you spend too much time in the weeds, you get really myopic, you lose sight of the bigger picture, and you also won't really get traction, right? You just kind of get analysis paralysis. So wonder and rigor are copacetic and are really essential to understand how you can design time and space for both of them in your work.
I love that you put this kind of, it's a tension, but it's also kind of a symbiosis. And I think it helps people coming from both sides of it, which people tend to do. They kind of come from either the rigor and, oh, I'm not creative, or they come from the creative and, oh, I'm awe, but I struggle with the rigor. Because you've got a chapter, I forget which book, but it's put bravery before mastery, jumping in before you're ready, trying the thing badly. But then on the opposite side of that, you've got the rigor argument that says you can't break the rules until you've mastered them. And I think, and the thing is that both are true. You can leap before you're ready, and you can earn the leap. And it just kind of matters where you're coming from and entering in to then adopt more of the other, the one you're lacking some of, I guess.
Yeah, it's situational, right? It's incredibly situational, which means it requires a lot of self-awareness. If we're talking about our own individual practice, it requires a lot of observation. If you're managing a team, if you're managing a process, anyone who's managed project management or product management knows that it's a very fine-tuned process. You have an action plan, but you are always tweaking and moving the gauge up slightly here or there. You're adapting, and rigor is very adaptive. Sometimes we think we're being rigorous and we're actually being rigid. And the difference between rigidity and rigor is that rigidity is not adaptive. Rigidity is not humble. It's very proud. It says, we said we were going to go this direction and we are going in this direction, even though all these alarm bells are going off. And rigor is incredibly adaptive, and it says, okay, let's go back into our toolbox. This is not working. What do we need to tweak? Who do we need to ask for help? What do we need to adjust in order to make sure we are back on track? And I just also wanted to say, Eric, I like the way you said that and it was a really nice compliment. So thank you for saying this, that you look at the work that I've done as kind of giving us a map. And I like to say that I really am giving us a compass for identifying our true north, because while roadmaps are super comforting and they are, who doesn't want a roadmap, right? Who doesn't want an action plan? The challenge is, you lose Wi-Fi, or there's construction happening in the roadway, or you lose the roadmap, right? So knowing how to orienteer, knowing how to identify where your true north should really, in my view, be the goal, so that you can constantly be making your way forward. And wonder and rigor is that compass. Yeah.
I like that. I like that you're framing it that way. And in fact, part of that reorienting skill is knowing what other things you have in the toolbox. And so you make a real scientific case for daydreaming and the whole network in the brain, the default mode network that switches on when you stop engaging with the world. And that's where the brain connects dots and makes meaning. And you call daydreaming inside out work. So walk me through that 90-second daydream break. What does that actually look like in your day?
Well, it requires me to have access to looking at the sky, access to a window. If it's a nice day, I might go sit outside on my front stoop. If you work in an office building, it could involve, daydream breaks are really to tap into what I call our sentient intelligence, our sensory system. So it could be a daydream break where you're focusing on something visually to zone out. It could be something where you're focusing on sounds. So you could go into the hallway of an office building and just kind of listen. And it requires you to have a time limit. So I like to do just 90-second daydream breaks. It doesn't require a 30-minute meditation session or a 20-minute meditation session. It can be 90 seconds. It could be as long as 5 minutes. And so for me, I will stand by a window. I will watch the clouds drift. I will sometimes have my eyes zone in and out of focusing and then not focusing in an area of trees. I'll watch an insect. These are the things that I like to do in order to help my brain to relax and then go back to the work at hand. And it only takes 90 seconds. And the cool thing is that the neuroscience research on what science would call, I think they would put this in the category of mind wandering, is actually essential for creative work. And what is creativity? I call it toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. Other people have described it as the juxtaposition of ideas that people previously would have never put together. I like to call creativity, it's all about the mashup. It's about the remix. It's about the build. And if you're staring at your computer on an Excel sheet or on a Word document, and that is a heavy load on the frontal neocortex, stepping away for just that 90-second daydream break is so essential and helpful for that juxtaposition of ideas that help those eureka moments.
Yeah, and it's kind of for some people, they might accept or they might adapt or absorb this idea better if we call it something along the lines of a change of state or a switching of a switch between modes, something along those lines, that it's switching between a single tasking focus, like the Japanese idea of giving one act your whole attention versus turning that off and then letting yourself be at rest. It's the rubber band. It's the stretch it for tension and then allowing it to relax again, and kind of going back and forth between allowing of a wandering mind as well as then switching back into a laser focus.
Well, yes. Another shared language we could give it is divergent thinking and convergent thinking, right? Divergence is the mind wandering. Convergence is the focus. But even within that daydream, I might have a daydream where I get really focused on just a particular area of leaf. One time I was just kind of zoning out, looking at a tree, and then I was zoning in all of a sudden on the leaf, and the leaf was so intricate. It had all these veins and pathways, and as a morass of a tree, I could just skip over that part, but zoning in and doing that kind of convergent thinking is really helpful. But yeah, that ability to, first of all, be aware that we need to do that, and then to do it is really essential. And then the awareness that divergence, convergence, or what D. Hock called chaotic systems, chaos and order, which is really the theoretical foundation for the way I think about creativity, all complex systems. This is abundant in natural systems. So when you think about eating your lunch, you chew your food, how does that food get from your throat into your stomach? Through the esophagus, it has peristalsis. So it's contract, release, contract, release. How does blood flow through the vessels in our body? Contract, release. So throughout nature, all natural systems have divergence, convergence, have chaos, order, have stellar focus, and then release.
And this all has to do, I think, with curiosity and allowing yourself to pull on a thread and keep going with it for a bit. There's a practice that you talk about kind of in both books where instead of racing to an answer, you start by generating questions. Curiosity.
Yes. Yes. I love this exercise called question storming because we forget that often we can tell so much more about the quality of someone else's thinking, of a teammate's thinking, of our own thinking, about the quality of the questions that they're asking, even more than the quality of the answers that they might just be regurgitating. So, question storming is an exercise where instead of generating a number of answers and solutions to a problem that you're working on or that your team is working on. It could be a better marketing strategy. It could be ways to close a deal. It could be ways to generate revenue. It could be the holiday party. Whatever the prompt is, set a timer for just 90 seconds, 2 minutes, and challenge yourself, your team, to generate 5, minimum 10 questions about the particular challenge. And I like to add an additional constraint, which is to generate only what if questions, right? So really make it very specific, solo, quietly to yourself, 90 seconds, then partner off, share what the questions that you came up with. What's so interesting about the second phase is that often there's so much similarity and people tend to do mashups and remixes of the questions. And the third phase is to share out with the larger group. And you can gamify this. You can get the team to vote on their favorite top 2 questions. And it democratizes the brainstorming process, because I don't know about you, but I've been in brainstorming sessions where I feel like, yes, my idea is up on the whiteboard, or wah, 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 they didn't like my idea. It didn't really get captured on the whiteboard. There's something that really begins to blend and get democratized when we ask questions. And questions are very liberating. They're the beginning of a process to help us then explore, okay, this is exciting to us, this is audacious to us, or this is feasible for us. What's our very next first step that we want to do to tackle this?
Yeah. I think that's so interesting. And I love that idea of the brainstorming, because I definitely think that it's supposed to be this open, freeing thing. And yet it does kind of come in often in management and leadership that it's like this restrictive thing unintentionally, the way it's structured, that we've got it set up to do individually and collectively.
Yeah. And it's also very inviting to people who are introverts, right? Because it gives everyone time just quietly to themselves initially to just do a brain dump. No judgment. What are the questions that are coming up for you? And then share just with one person, and then, with the larger group. So it also balances out the different working styles and thinking styles that people have.
Pivoting a little bit here. So your chapter on rest, where you talk about that a bit, it doesn't open with a study. It opens with your dad. And I love this, by the way. You say he's one of the hardest working men you knew, juggling a sales job. And yet every Saturday, without fail, he stopped and he called it getting my rest. And he'd load the family into a station wagon, drive 11 hours to the beach. What did watching him teach you about rest that no research paper could?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you for referencing that. My father, it was his birthday over the July 4th weekend. He's passed away now, but I really spent that weekend reflecting on so much that he taught me through his actions, through his behaviors, through the way he cared for us. And seeing him stop and commit to resting every single Saturday, number one, it was a type of rigor in a way. It was a type of discipline. It was a level of commitment to his self-care. I didn't have those words back then, but it really was. He was exhibiting tending to himself with no exception. And for high school, from 7th through 12th grade, I went to a pretty rigorous Quaker prep school in Philadelphia. And there was always a ton of homework to do over the weekends. He also had just sports. And I would always try to bargain with him and say, but this is due on Monday. I've got to get this. There's no way I can get it done if I can't do any of this during the day. He would say, you'll get it done. And I couch for the audience. I grew up Jewish. So my dad he had a very traumatic childhood. He had 3 siblings, and they lost their mother when my dad was about 10, 11 years old. Their father didn't feel like he could take care of all the 4 kids. They were kind of split up, the girls and the boys, 2 girls and 2 boys. And the people who took in my dad and my uncle were in a congregation, were in a church. It was an African American congregation that was Jewish by faith, and so he carried on that faith when my mother converted, and we grew up that way. I'm not practicing anymore, but that was the foundation of my faith. So that just explained why my father looked at Saturday, the Sabbath day, as the day to always rest if we weren't going to tabernacle. And it just, so again, it taught me commitment, it taught me self-care, and whenever I would negotiate with him unsuccessfully, lo and behold, the work still got done. So that also taught me, there's this thing called the Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule.
Yes.
Where 20% of 80% of everything usually gets in the last 20% remaining of time, right? And what I began to observe even then, I didn't have the language and the words for it, but I was marinating on ideas on a paper I had to read, and I couldn't work on it. And it was getting me more organized in my mind, in my head, so that on the Sunday when I had time to really go to it, it came out, it flowed, and I got the work done. And I carried that forward in college to make sure I built in buffers to rest. Again, didn't have the language or the words back then, but my dad was modeling that for me.
That's so cool. And if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned July 4th. That also was a Saturday this past.
And actually, so his birthday was July 5th, but over the July 4th weekend.
But it's that weekend. Yeah. That's so cool. Yeah. I'm glad I'm glad that all kind of ties together for you. That's so cool. I love it.
Thank you.
Speaking of like lack of words to call things, there's also this kind of idea of dormancy, a word you probably wouldn't have had back then either. I know that you say you used to hate winter until you read Catherine May's book Wintering, and it reframed this whole idea of dormancy for you, that essentially quiet and nothing seems to be happening season does just as much for us as spring. So it's more of a macro level, like we were talking about earlier, between, in a single day. This has more to do with, a slow week or a stretch of months where you're doing less. I don't think people wrap their heads around that. How have you adopted that for yourself?
One of the things, so when I started thinking, a perk was that I had greater control over my calendar. And in the first couple of years, I was just terrified it would all come to a screeching halt. So I didn't always do this, but it was probably the first summer I went to the beach every Monday. I just had a day. I live in Philly, so the Jersey Shore is pretty close by. And and I would just have Mondays where they were days in this. So start out just in the summertime, where I would get up I'd leave the house by 6:15 a.m. I'd be on the beach by 7:30 a.m. I'd leave by noon. I'd pick up a hoagie at Wawa, which anyone from the area knows what Wawa is. It's a crazy sounding word if you're not from around here. And then make my way home. I'd make sure I'd bring a book of fiction. I'd nap a little. I'd jump around the waves. And then by year 3, throughout the year, I just was making sure I would never have calls scheduled on Mondays, and then Mondays and Fridays. So I really now design my calendar so that Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, sometimes it depends. Sometimes they're bottleneck squeezes of days, but other times it's fine. It's pretty manageable. But I really like to be able to have this cadence where I can ease into my week on the Monday and then ease out of my week on the Friday. The other thing that I do is I'm a very kinesthetic person. I learn through movement and tinkering. For me, a form of rest actually is dance classes, which I know might sound counterintuitive because how could that be restful? You're moving, but it's interacting with myself in a very different way. I do a lot of cerebral work and thinking. So to be attuned to my body is incredibly liberating and joyful and fun. To me, that's a form of rest. I swim probably once or twice a week, at least once a week. So these are forms of rest. And then I really build in daydream breaks throughout the day. I have short walks to buffer in my schedule. And I also write into my schedule the word buffer. It could be 30 minutes, it could be an hour. I think sometimes more of us don't take a walk throughout the day because we think we need 45 minutes set aside or 30 minutes. You can do a walk that's 7 minutes long. You can do a walk up and down the stairs or down your driveway or around your block, and do an experiment and just track the ways that you feel for the next 5 days doing that, how you show up for the next Zoom call. And the thing about habits need 66 times for us to repeat them before they stick, and they need reward. So the reward is serotonin, relaxation. Positivity is a contagion, and you will get into that habit of building in that time.
Definitely. And one of the ways that we can do that is let's lean into this new chapter in the book about AI. AI can help you, as you say it. It's not about being productive. It's about flourishing, or at least you say that the organizations that are getting AI right, they're not asking the question, how can AI make people more productive? They're asking the question, how can AI help people flourish? So let's unpack the difference there between those two questions, because I think that's right there. That's the game.
Yeah, I think that the miss that I'm observing is that we are assuming we are in the middle of a technological revolution. But the truth is that we're in the middle of a human revolution. Because at the end of the day, this is technology. It is a tool. And we must take agency to make sure that we don't engage in this tech FOMO or tech crush, I call it, tech infatuation of keeping up with the Joneses and making sure that, on a company-wide scale, that we're adopting the same sort of AI tools that we think our competitors have. The question we should be asking is, how might this tech amplify what makes us uniquely human? What if we are in a unique moment in time where we are having the opportunity to become the most flourishing humans ever because we have technology that can do basic tasks more quickly? The answer to this found time is not to fill it with busyness and more stuff. The opportunity is to engage with the spaciousness, with eyeball-to-eyeball conversations, with critical thinking, with deeper collaboration that's a build on the answers that we now have from the AI tools. That, to me, is the shift, and we have to be very intentional about it. We must insist on it. We can build public policy around it. We can build KPIs around it so that we don't just kind of sit back and let AI happen to us and end up with these dystopian futures, which could happen, but we could also have a future where the tech allows for more equity, where the tech allows for greater efficiencies, but also more human contact, because we have this found time. But that requires responsibility on our parts and intentionality and agency.
Yeah. And you're not, there's a real tension there. You're not anti-AI. You
No.
use it constantly. And in fact, you even transcribed one of your books as you were walking, and that's awesome. But you're also honest about it too, with something you called the double bind. You want to embrace the tools, but consider the cost. And there's even a personal aspect of it to you, because there was some of your work being used to train AI without your permission. And that's definitely a tension there. So, how do you kind of hold both those thoughts in your head at once? Not that that's impossible.
Yeah, I mean, holding both those thoughts is the same way I can love Miles Davis's music and acknowledge that he was not a nice man to live with. He was horrific to Cicely Tyson when he was dating her, married to her. He was physically abusive. I can hold both those ideas in the same way that I acknowledge I'm proud to be an American, and I'm also African American. So there are a lot of nuances in the way that I experience the American dream. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's TBD. I think, to be able to be a critically thinking human is to be able to navigate complexity with, as you said, with curiosity, pausing, observing how other people deal with it. So two things can be true at the same time. And again, citing an incredible dance teacher, in partner dancing, at every point, the follow has agency. It's not like the follower is being dragged around the dance floor. There is a conversation that is constantly happening. And this teacher pointed out that change happens in the incongruence. Tension, abrasion, friction. We don't want a frictionless society. Friction yields energy. Let's use that energy for something positive, which is what Jerry Hirschberg, who thought of the term creative abrasion, was talking about when he was head of design at Nissan. So we shouldn't sugarcoat things. We shouldn't say nothing to see here. The tech is great. AI is fine. But we also can't go down a doomsday tunnel of the bots will take over. Really, what can we do today to ensure that that doesn't happen, to ensure that technology actually amplifies us to be uniquely human?
Yeah, I love that. And we've kind of been talking about this kind of, tension sounds like a negative word. It's more of a, again, I think symbiosis, or it's a conversation. It's an equilibrium, if you will.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. And you make this case that productivity isn't the point. And then you also spend time saying that rest and daydream deliver limitless business return. And so for some people, there's a tension there. It's like, well, isn't that still talking about productivity, but it's just in a different outfit? And I would say that ultimately that's the point. We all have nuance, and we all have semantics about how we talk about this, how we label it. But when it comes down to it, it's about being fully human in our work and in our life.
And I will say that the book Move, Think, Rest is a provocation. And I'm not anti-productivity. I am pro flourishing. I am anti-productivity at the cost of burnout. I'm anti-productivity at the cost of dehumanizing the workplace. I'm anti-productivity at the cost of appreciating the humans and the people who make things run, who make us realize that organizations are actually organisms because they consist of humans. And I'll point out that the subtitle of Move, Think, Rest is redefining productivity and our relationship with time. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be productive. We should be productive. I'm actually offering a means to being productive in a way that gives us business results, that makes us connected as humans, and that helps us to be whole as individuals and to want to show up at work instead of feeling we're dying a slow death at work.
Exactly. Yeah. No one's saying don't be productive, and no one's saying there aren't better ways to be productive, but there are definitely ways to do it without burning out and without feeling like again, we go back to the box. You got to call out the box first, right? So
exactly. Yes.
So I love this, the flourishing versus thriving distinction there. So last thing, somebody's listening to this right now on a commute, and they're wondering where to start. So they're probably already doing some of this without naming it. What's one small thing they can do before bed tonight to start to enter into this awe and wonder and rigor relationship equilibrium?
I have a few things. They can have a daydream break before they go to sleep. It's not meditation, which is about like focusing back in, bring your attention back in. It's allowing your mind to wander and timing it. That's one simple thing they could do. They can assign a block of time, an hour tomorrow, which is a buffer time. Or if they can't afford to do that, then they can make sure that there are like 9-minute pauses in between calls, and they step away from this. They don't take their phone. They take a walk, they drink a glass of water, and they return to the work at hand. And the other thing I love for them to do is to pick a work of fiction to read, because fiction, not nonfiction, which a lot of us have to read all the time, but fiction sparks the imagination. It develops curiosity. It engages you in another time, geography, gender, age, and it resets the nervous system. So those are 3 things. Pick one they can do tonight.
Yeah, awesome. Those are great suggestions. And Natalie, I loved talking with you. I would love to have you back on the show in the future. But in the meantime, let's point people to where they can find The Creative Leap, Move, Think, Rest, and Figure 8 Thinking, and everything else you're working on.
Sure. Again, thank you very much, Eric, for having me today. And if people go to figure 8, the number 8 thinking, FIGURE, the number 8 thinking.com, join the Wonder Rigor newsletter. It's a monthly free newsletter, lots of tips and techniques and announcements about how to build this practice to build your own creative capability. And then you'll also find on that website links to purchase Move, Think, Rest, and the second edition of the Creativity Leap, both of which are also available on Amazon, but figure8thinking.com.
Perfect. I will make sure to link that up in the show notes. And Natalie, thank you so much for being here. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's another podcast crossed off your podcast listening to-do list. What stuck with me from this conversation is that reframe at the center of both of Natalie's books, that most important work that we do is usually invisible, and that the real question was never, how do I do more? It's, what is this all for? And she makes the case that daydreaming and walking and resting, all things that I love doing, are the real work. That's where your brain is breathing. That's where your brain is making connections, not sitting there trying to figure the problem out, because our brains are smarter than we think they are. They can solve the problems and connect the dots when we're not staring at the dots, forcing them to connect. And so if any part of that landed for you, both books are worth your time. The second edition of The Creativity Leap and Move, Think, Rest. Start with whichever one you can't stop thinking about. And if you've got somebody in your life who wears their busyness like a badge, that person who, when you ask them, how are you, they say, so busy, every single time, this is the episode for them. Share it with them. Do me and them the favor of sharing it with them right now from the show notes at beyondthetodolist.com, or hit that share button in your podcast player app of choice. Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next episode.